So guys, I want to talk about Project Night Fam, and I definitely enjoy their content. And they're doing a video, and they're talking about like one of the big controversial issues in this country. And the controversial issue is gentle parenting versus strict parenting. And when I was in high school, I took parenting classes, part of an elective. And one thing that I learned that always stuck with me is that good parenting is that when you start strict and then eventually you move into democratic parenting. And democratic parenting is exactly what you see in Family Matters, where you explain a situation. Sometimes, if it's a serious situation, you're a little bit more harsher, but you also give a hard but fair consequence, and then also you explain why it's happening. Like a great example would be in the episode where Clarence and Eddie where Clarence steals a car and Eddie joyrides in it as well. So Miss Harriet Winslow talks to him about how you're not cool for stealing a car. You want to mess up your own life, that's fine. He doesn't take accountability. He gets sent back home, and he gets shamed really. That's his consequence. But she's also lecturing him about that he's not cool for the disrespect that he's showing, and then also Eddie gets punished for having to do meals on wheels for a year for getting into a stolen car. So that's an example of democratic parenting. So with strict parenting, there are positives and negatives for that. And strict parenting, that's usually means you curse at a kid, you hit a kid, you say, like, you use offensive language, like saying, don't you touch that motherfucking hot stove or I'm going to kick your fucking ass, and other things like that. And there's a couple of things about about abusive parenting. No, about old school parenting. Is that number one, sometimes it is appropriate. Like, I remember one time my little brother was like 4 or 5 years old, and he was running into the street, and he never followed directions. So he always thought it was funny to run out of the house and run into the road. So my dad shouted at him on the top of his lungs, and my brother cried, and he ran back, really. That's an example of when strict parenting works, because he was doing something dangerous. He was not following directions, and we reacted appropriately. Now, I remember one time that I had a baby, that my brother had a babysitter, and one thing that happened while she was in the other room, and my brother was doing a bunch of bad behavior. He was slapping me, he was saying the word fuck, and he was running out of the house, and he was just arguing. So I put him over my knee, and I wailed his ass really, really hard, because there were a lot of times when I was told to let it go, really. But after that, he never had an issue with hitting me or running out of the house, really. Like, I just wailed his ass really, really hard. And even though that was strict, really, it stopped him from that bad behavior of swearing, being a 4 or 5 year old kid saying the word fuck, and it also stopped him from running out of the house, really. So that was an example of strict parenting in a way that helps the kid. When you need to stop a dangerous behavior, sometimes yelling at a kid or sometimes physical discipline is appropriate, sometimes it isn't. There are examples of strict parenting not being good. Like, for example, when I was in middle school, my parents got mad at me because what happened is that we had a baptism celebration, and 3 or 4 weeks later, we were having brunch at one of my dad's friends, and he was mad that I couldn't remember the name of these 2 people, really. There was actually over 100 people, and he was saying things like, all the name of those 150 fucking Pokemons. And then also he called me a fucking asshole. And then he also said something like, if you don't remember the names of everybody at that party, I'm throwing the TV out the fucking window. So that's an example of, old school parenting not right, really. Because first of all, that's just not appropriate, really. Like, honestly, with kids, as psychologists say, that, okay, you're meeting a random friend that you never met before, if it's different from, like, a grandmother or an uncle, really. So, like, just to be like, okay, I expect you to remember everybody that you meet, really, that's not appropriate. And then also using verbal language, verbally abusive language is not appropriate. And then also the other thing, too, is that it's an overreaction. Oh, if you don't remember the name of 10 people, I'm going to throw the television out the window and other things like that. My parents, me and my brother were both misdiagnosed with autism. So my parents kind of felt that this was like the war against autism. This is how we improve social skills. And that's not how you do that, because then it kind of, you create an unpleasant experience with teaching somebody social skills. So that's an example of old school parenting, not done well. Another example that I would have is that we had a dog, and the dog had an issue with pooping in the house. So some of my relatives would hit the dog, kick the dog, pick up the dog and throw the dog down out of the house, really, and other things like that. The dog never stopped having an issue with pooping in the house, really. But yeah, it was one of those things too where that wasn't really how should I say, that wasn't really disciplined, and that may have been old school, because that was old school mentality of being harsh with animals to teach them that they don't run the household. But that was also kind of like, that was teaching fear, that was also teaching violence, and that was also teaching double standards, really, because it's one of those things too, like, if you have a relative that's sick and they accidentally shit on themselves, you're not going to be like picking your relative up and throwing them down a flight of stairs, or throwing them down a flight of stairs of a porch out of the house, really. So like, there are many situations where that's not appropriate. As someone who's grew up in a household with a lot of just, old school parenting, I have low self-esteem. I have trauma responses. I have flashbacks of my childhood that are not pleasant. And then also, I used to get bullied a lot in the workplace. I used to have people insult me to my face, make fun of my race, make fun of my skin color, think that I'm mentally ill and stuff like that. And some of the reasons why that came from was because I was really taught to obey authority, even if authority is disrespectful. And like I've said in another video, you teach the Rochelle parenting, Rochelle from Everybody Hates Chris, which is, children are to be disrespected and parents are not. Children are to show respect. Parents can show disrespect. So that's one of the reasons why that doesn't work, And then the other part of it is, and then the other part of it is that, it doesn't teach kids to be leaders. It doesn't teach kids to stand up for themselves. It teaches kids to avoid relationships or be in abusive relationships, because they're always taught to never stand up for themselves. And then also, there are people like me, and I've struggled very well with this deep list, that of a fear of success, really, because I'm like, I don't want to be successful because I don't want people screaming and yelling at me and flipping out or manipulating me until reaching my full potential. Why should I? Okay, well, I'm really, really smart. Why should I become a nurse? Why should I apply to become a nurse, really, when I know that I'll be dealing with patients screaming and yelling at me? Or if I tell my father, he'll put me through medical school, and then he'll be like, what the fuck is this? You gotta see fucking bullshit and all that stuff, So when we teach the Full Metal Jacket method of screaming and yelling and cursing and undermining and flipping the fuck out, really, we don't actually, motivate our kids to do better. We actually can demotivate them. That's why, like, sometimes old school parenting doesn't work, but old school parenting works in certain situations. Obviously, if a kid with behavioral issues and you need to keep them under control, that works. If that's the only way a kid can respond to being controlled, that works. And then when kids are young and are just born, like the first 5 or 6 years of your life, you have to be strict. And then you move over into more democratic parenting. Gentle parenting, there's ups and downs to it. I think with gentle parenting, you have better relationships with your children, because not every situation needs to be screaming and yelling. The other thing, too, is that you teach children, in some cases, to be respectful to others. Because honestly, if you want to be a good leader at work, you have to hold people accountable for their actions, but you also have to teach them respect. And then when you have people who are respectful, you get more teamwork elements. And I think the other thing, too, is that, honestly, if you want to become a nurse or a teacher or a psychiatrist, you have to be nice and compassionate, really. Or if you want relationships, you have to be nice and compassionate. There are certain levels of protecting yourself or being stern or putting your foot down. But when you teach gentle parenting, you kind of raise people with better interpersonal skills, more than somebody who is raised with old school parenting or strict parenting. Because old school and strict parenting, you can raise the personality of somebody who grows up to be antisocial or you can raise somebody that grows up to be taken advantage of. But there are a lot of downsides to gentle parenting, which is that one of the big things is the mental illness get out of jail free card, where some people may like say, okay, well, if you have a kid that's mentally ill, you let them do whatever they want without any consequences. The next thing is accommodation culture. Like I was talking about, like there was a girl who was in a wheelchair and she had special needs, and she kept making sounds in a movie theater and disrupting people. But her mother was saying that's discrimination. But do you think what you want? Do you think other people want to hear that um, all the time, really? And then there's also social customs and other things like that. So if somebody's like talking like that or making that sound, really, why should we teach that everybody in the world has to kind of fit that one person's needs? So the problem with gentle parenting is it teaches that it's all about you, and that's been a huge issue in our country. It's not always about one person. And then I also will say is that it's just not consequence appropriate. That there are some things like that there are some situations where if, like I said, if you have a kid that's misbehaving, you say no, please don't do it, and a bunch of times you're still doing it, then that's not working. So sometimes it leads to situations where kids know that there's no real consequences. I think a great example. This is not. I know this is a cartoon, but this is South Park in South Park. Like how Eric Cartman is. He doesn't really face that many consequences for his actions unless his mother gets a little bit humiliated. So so that's kind of like the thing too. If you always kind of raise a lack of consequences, it enables bad behavior. You look at The Simpsons with how Marge Simpson tries to have understanding of Bart, but Bart continues bad behavior, really. Sometimes he punches, sometimes he doesn't. But if you're always too compassionate, there may be a situation where your kids take advantage of that, or they just don't think the consequences are going to be that dire, or you're going to be like, okay, just too friendly with them. So there's positive and negatives. I think I'll give you an example of. I'll give you an example that I remember. Like one time in college, I had an emotional breakdown, and I did some very offensive artwork. I can't. Um, all right, I'll tell you what it was. That what happened was I had an ex-girlfriend that I was friends with. She told me that she was being abused and other things like that. And then I later found out years after this happened, it was a bunch of lies. So I made some artwork that was very like, depicting some of the abuse that she was suffering. And it was all kind of like some sexual abuse and other things like that. And I remember like how a bunch of people were kind of offended, and I kind of talked about that, but I had an emotional breakdown. And I remember like yelling and cursing and losing control of my emotions. And it was like I caused a scene where over 50, 60 people were looking at me. And I kind of was like saying, the world's fucked up, everything's fucked up, my life's fucked up. It seems like everybody that I care about, some fucked up things happen to me. This is a metaphor for saying that this woman that I love is like a goddess to me, and my goddess being violated. And I remember there was a couple of things that happened. That, number one, that my professor invited me out to lunch with him the day after because he understood that I had an emotional breakdown. The next thing that he said was that I should just go to therapy, and I chose to go to therapy by myself. I chose to go to therapy, and that should have been the thing. You either go to therapy, or you should be removed for the rest of the semester or something like that. But he invited me out to lunch, threw in therapy. The other thing was that there was a scholarship award to go to a student like the Vermont Fellowship Center, but they still gave it to me like the day after, even though I just had an outburst. And then the other thing about it was that I remember like a lot of people being like pushed off, turned off from me. I'm not told people this, but I remember when I graduated college, nobody applauded me because I had some antisocial behavior. But also there was some double standards. There was a lot of just people who were racist or doing inappropriate things. But my college was one of those things too, where it seemed like every single year they picked somebody to bully, really. But as a student body, there's always like somebody that got singled out and bullied, particularly. But the thing about it that I would say is that was an example of what's that fucking term? that was an example of permissive parenting or millennial parenting or gentle parenting, where my professor should have been a little hard with me and said, okay, clearly, you know what, you need to be in control of your emotions, and you clearly need to get yourself therapy, but also too that you just can't be offensive because you're going through a hard time. And that's one of the biggest mistakes I made in my life, is thinking that because I'm going through a lot and I have an emotional outburst, people need to be kind and understanding, but that's not appropriate, really. So that was not a good situation. I think another situation I'll give you guys is my younger brother, because when he grew up, he was very spoiled. He was given a lot of chances. When he talked back, given a lot of chances. A few weeks ago, he had a wedding, and I wasn't invited to it. And my parents just didn't really, they didn't like kind of say, okay, well, hey Byron, you never really reached out to us, so you know what, that's why we didn't get an invitation. It was kind of really hurtful, but my parents, like, they don't care really. So the thing about it is that my brother was very spoiled, and the other things too is that he also kind of, I think in a way, wants to be this kind of like model child, really. Like, my parents always wanted a black kid. My parents always kind of wanted a kid that would just take out, that would have like grandchildren. And then the other thing too was that me and my older brother had mental health issues, so they kind of almost have a mentality of, what, even though they were emotionally abusive and had other issues, they always had kind of a mentality of, what, if you guys have a troubled adulthood, it's not on us, it's on your mental illness type of mentality. So with my younger brother, it's almost like they can kind of have the perfect child, or the fantasy of the perfect child, really. I don't talk to those two losers or what type of thing, really. Even though I went through PTSD and other things, and I did not have a good support system, type of thing, really. So that's also with gentle parenting, is that sometimes you allow your kids to disrespect other relatives. Sometimes you treat one children better than you treat other children. Sometimes you have stereotypes, like one children is good that you do gentle parenting with, the other children that you're strict and harsh with, you don't do good. And that brings me up to a final story where I remember one time, my little brother wouldn't walk the dog, and he had an allowance, so my dad asked me to do it, and then my dad threatened me to do it because he couldn't control my younger brother, really. So that's an example of gentle and strict parenting. So like I said, democratic parenting is the right one, where it's two things. You have to start strict with a child, and as soon as they're between 6 and 8 years old, where they understand reason, you switch over to democratic parenting, whereas you're strict, you have consequences, and you explain things. And then you say to yourself, maybe I need to be a little bit more lenient if the kid is doing very well, and if the kid's being harder, is just being hard-headed, you have to be a little bit more hard-headed. And that's what you do, really. But also you explain why things are happening, really. I've known many people who were raised by being hit with a belt, really. But one thing that their parents do, they talk to them why being hit with a belt was appropriate, even though being hit with a belt was not appropriate. But I do think that gentle parenting enables a lot of bad behavior. And I also think that strict parenting can influence a lot of antisocial behavior, or it can create a lot of being behind in social skills. Because like I've said, you look at my example where I've had issues socialized, but it got worse because I grew up with harshness and being taught that, what, I'm not allowed to be a leader. My opinion doesn't matter, really. It's my opinion to follow orders, and being manipulated, and being spoken down to, really. So yeah, you always have to choose the right thing, really. But democratic parenting is the right one. Gentle parenting has its problems, and so does old school parenting. In some ways they're effective. They work for certain children, and sometimes strict old school parenting works for certain children, and sometimes gentle parenting works for some children, and democratic parenting works for other children. But but we all have to also understand too that as we become adults, really, that no matter what we've been through, we have to get the most that we can out of life. So I didn't like how I was raised with a strict parent, But but that's what I got, Roland. I got to live my best life possible. And even if I say things like I would never want a relationship, or I would never have kids, or I would get a girl pregnant, that'd be the worst day of my life when my kid's born. And then I may turn into a screaming, yelling maniac, just like my father was. Um, so yeah, it's unfortunate when we deal with those things, but I gotta live my life best possible with the cards that I've been dealt with. So really think about how you raise your kids, really, and also understand that strict parenting, has its ups and downs, really, but it's not the solution. And then also that culture of permissive parenting or gentle parenting has ups and downs, really. And then also democratic parenting does as well, really. But also the other thing that I would say with you is that you got to treat your kids like like they're humans. So you don't treat them like they're so soft that they need to be protected, or they need gentleness. And you also don't treat your kids like everybody hates Chris, really, where you're like, okay, well, you're a kid. I put food on the table, fuck you and all that stuff. Because if you teach a kid that, they're not going to grow to be good members of society. They're going to grow. They're going to grow to be, vulnerable um, people who just don't. Very vulnerable people who believe in that thinking that authority figures will have every right to disrespect them, but they're not allowed to stand up for themselves. And that's kind of how I turned out. But I'm really fixed. But I'm willing to fix myself. All right. Well, that's all I gotta say.